Norman Powell has finally spoken out about his trade away from the Raptors at the 2021 deadline, and he made a bold claim about what the team would look like had he stayed. Do you think you're going to agree with him? Let's get into it. Welcome everybody to Amateur Hour Sports, the YouTube channel that is dedicated to Toronto Raptors content and videos just like this. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel to keep up to date with all the other videos I have coming out on this channel all about the Toronto Raptors. And if you enjoy what you see from this video, make sure you do hit that like button. It really does help out with that YouTube algorithm. Norman Powell is a little bit of a cult hero in his time with the Toronto Raptors. He wasn't necessarily a superstar player. He wasn't necessarily one of the very best players in the league, but he was consistent. And for a while, he was a bit of a star player for the Raptors, particularly in that 2020-2021 season where he was eventually traded away to the Portland Trail Blazers. And Norman Powell, in a recent interview, has finally spoken about his trade away from the Raptors and how it made him feel, how it affected him, and what his thoughts were on what the Raptors really could have been had he remained in Toronto. That 2020-2021 season, it was tough. Yes, that was the year that Norman Powell got traded away, but it was a season of change really for the Raptors in many different ways. It was a very, very bleak reminder of what can happen to an NBA team if a season starts poorly and how much it can spin out of control. 2 years prior to that season, the Raptors were NBA champions. The season before that, they were the 2 seed in the NBA before falling off a little bit heading into the NBA bubble and ultimately losing the second round to the Boston Celtics. I think in a non-COVID season where you have Pascal Siakam firing on all cylinders, it'd be very tough to stop the Raptors coming out of the East that season. But regardless, a second round exit and a championship in the seasons prior, it left us with some great expectations heading into that 2020-2021 season, even though the Raptors were playing all of their home games in a different building because they were in Tampa Bay for that season. And despite the fact the Raptors were struggling, despite the fact the Raptors were hampered by players entering health and safety protocols and missing games, Mr. Consistent was Norman Powell, constantly producing at a very high clip for the Toronto Raptors. In fact, it was the very highest clip he had ever produced at in his NBA career, averaging near 20 points per game on some outstanding efficiency, pushing 50% shooting from the field and 44% shooting from three. Norman Powell was on his absolute top of his game in this spell for the Raptors, which allowed for Masai Ujiri to potentially capitalize on his value, because the complication for Powell was he was in a contract year, and this is typically where players can play their best because they know the financial aspect that is on the line when they need to earn that contract. So Powell was playing absolutely out of his mind. The Raptors, well, they were kind of juggling and trying to jostle for exactly what their team was going to be. At that point in the season, it had become clear the Raptors were tanking. They were trying to lose games on purpose by resting players, by having players out of the lineup so that they could get a better draft pick. Norman Powell was a player that definitely helped the team win, but we were worried about what the team would look like for the rest of the season. We were worried about what the team would look like specifically next season. The Raptors maybe hope to get back into contention, but it would be difficult to bounce back from a season just like this. So, not wanting to have to worry about paying Norman Powell, especially Norman Powell starting to age a little bit, Masai Ujiri pulled the trigger on a trade and shocked the fan base when he dealt Norman Powell to the Portland Trail Blazers and acquired Gary Trent Jr. And if many people forget, Rodney Hood was actually involved in that deal. Now, Rodney Hood really didn't do anything for the Raptors for the rest of the season, but the main piece in there is Gary Trent Jr. And as the season wore on, we really started to think as Raptors fans that the Raptors absolutely won this trade. And years later, 2.5 years later, maybe we're still thinking that we won this trade, because even though Gary Trent Jr. is producing similar numbers to Norman Powell, he's doing so at a far younger age. Now, where we'll really see the long-term effects of this trade is the contract situation, because we were worried about Norman Powell signing again for the team, and we were definitely worried about how much he was going to want from that contract. Well, Norman Powell ended up staying with the Portland Trail Blazers. He's been traded away since to the Los Angeles Clippers, but he stayed with the Portland Trail Blazers and signed on about as team-friendly as a deal as you can get for a player producing the numbers that I showed you previously. Starting out with a $15 million contract that, yes, it grew every year, but right now he's heading into a season where he's going to be making $18 million. That goes to 19, then above $20 million. And, I mean, even by today's standards, the contracts that we're seeing, this is a great contract, and I can only imagine how much better it may look if Powell keeps up this great plays into his early 30s, which I expect him to do. Gary Trent Jr., we did get Gary Trent to sign again for the team as he was a restricted free agent. He's heading into the third year of his contract after picking up a player option where he signed a contract worth 2 + 1, about $18 million per year. So if Trent does get the extension with the Raptors, then maybe we can start talking about who really won the trade. At this point, I mean, the trade itself was pretty even. Portland lost because they dealt Norman Powell to the Clippers for a bunch of spare parts. That didn't really make a lot of sense to me at the time. But the trade, the way we look at it from a Raptors perspective, it seems decent. But one thing that Gary Trent just lacks for me that Norman Powell had that makes me miss Norman Powell so much was just a downright consistency. You always knew you were going to get an insanely high intensity level out of Norman Powell on the court, and you typically got a very good level of production from him on the court as well. Gary Trent is a little bit more higher variance. He has some absolutely outstanding games, but he has some absolute duds of performances as well. So as far as who won the trade, because you're getting similar production out of a player who is quite a bit younger, you could argue that the Raptors were the winners of this trade. It'd be hard to argue differently, but ultimately, you still miss Norman Powell a little bit if you are a Toronto Raptors fan. And according to Norman Powell in this recent interview, he misses Toronto as well because Norman Powell did not want to get traded away from the Raptors in that season. Everything was kind of cultivating towards the Raptors moving Kyle Lowry at the deadline. We never really anticipated Norman Powell getting moved. The whole discourse towards that deadline, in fact, the day before the deadline, when the Raptors played the Denver Nuggets and absolutely blew the doors off that team and won by, I can't quite remember top of it, but like 30, 40 points against the Denver Nuggets. We didn't know it was Norman Powell's last game, but we thought it was going to be Kyle Lowry's last game. In fact, Kyle Lowry thought it was going to be Kyle Lowry's last game because he was seen crying after the game. But ultimately, the Lowry trade never happened. The Norman Powell trade did materialize, and Norman Powell was hurt. He felt like this team had a ton of potential. This whole group, even beyond, the championship where Kawhi Leonard leaves, Danny Green leaves, and the season after, Marc Gasol leaves, Serge Ibaka leaves. It still felt as though there was a real continuity with the group, and it was still the same group keeping together. Norman Powell with Pascal Siakam, with Fred VanVleet, with OG Anunoby. He even name-dropped Chris Boucher and wants to speak about...
We had a solid group of guys. Chris Boucher, I don't want to leave nobody out, but...
Other players also within that group, even though DeLon Wright got traded, even though Jakob Poeltl got traded, really still felt as though that group was together. That group that was a 2 seed in the year previously. But losses can really shake up a team, and it shook Masai enough to want to make that deal with Norman Powell and send him to the Portland Trailblazers. But Powell... it really does kind of open your eyes as what this team could have been. Powell really believes that the Toronto Raptors, had they kept him, had they kept that core together, could have become what the Boston Celtics are today, with Jason Tatum, with Jaylen Brown, and that team really building up together, building the foundation, but progressing to different levels together. It kind of felt as though the Raptors were going to be a team that did that, especially last season, 2 seasons ago now. After drafting Scotty Barnes, that team won 48 games, with the 5th seed in the Eastern Conference. It still felt as though that unit was together. You still had OG, you still had Pascal, you still had VanVleet. And then you had Scotty Barnes adding into that group, supplementing that group. But things really fell off again last season. And another key piece leaves in Fred VanVleet. The Boston Celtics might be a little bit different because they have 2 all-NBA caliber players right at the top of their game right now, ascending to different levels. But even them, they find it difficult to go and win an NBA championship. They've been close, but they still don't have that elusive championship. And it cost them maybe a player that was part of that continuity as well in Marcus Smart, who was dealt in this offseason in favor of going for Kristaps Porzingis. The jury is out on how that trade is going to affect the team. But overall, even if you do consider the Raptors, if they kept Powell, as a team that could have become what the Boston Celtics are today, Boston is still proving how difficult it is to go and win that NBA championship. But I think the situations are a little bit different. Powell was an outstanding player, but even though they were playing in Tampa, the team was struggling. The team probably needed a shakeup, and the team was very much concerned about losing a player for free. I mean, we talk so often now. I talk so often on this channel about losing players for free and worrying about losing players for free. Well, Masai Ujiri made a decision at the 2021 deadline that he was not going to lose Norman Powell for free and opted to go for Gary Trent Jr. on the restricted free agency. Maybe a wise move, but who knows? Norman Powell says he was hurt, said he wanted to stay in Toronto. Had there been more money to chase elsewhere, would he have elected to go to a different team? Potentially the Lakers would have been lurking around. Potentially the Clippers would have been lurking around. We don't know what would have happened, but we guaranteed that we kept a player of similar production and that was younger and didn't have to worry about any of those contract situations, especially with the contract of Kyle Lowry looming and his free agency impending for the Raptors. So a conservative and sensible decision was made by Masai Ujiri. Had he not made that decision, I still kind of struggle to see the Raptors being what the Celtics are. Even though they haven't won a championship, it's a perennial contender. It's a team that stays right near the top of the Eastern Conference every season. Judging by the way the Raptors have played since that trade, with Gary Trent, I mean, he's still providing a great role for the Raptors. It's not like Gary Trent's a drop off from Norman Powell really in any way. Maybe very slightly because of the efficiency and the consistency, but overall, not much of a drop off there. So I really don't see how this team, minus Gary Trent plus Norman Powell, really gets itself to the next level and is that perennial contender. Who knows? That's just my thoughts on it. What would be your thoughts on it? Do you think if the Raptors had not made that trade that they would be on a similar level to what the Boston Celtics are today? Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below, because that is it for me for today. Drop a like if you did enjoy this video. It does help out the channel a lot. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel as well to keep up to date with all this Raptors content coming out up until the new season and beyond. We'll see you again next time for another video.